This presentation covers material for developing reinforcement programs and increasing behavior. It goes along with chapters 7 and 11 in the book, along with the additional readings on self-monitoring and reinforcement. Before you develop any kind of plan for increasing behaviors, or before you develop any kind of reinforcement plan, you need a baseline measure of the behavior. Not only does this allow you to evaluate the effectiveness of your intervention, but as you'll see, it actually determines how you're going to deliver reinforcement. Reinforcement programs do not work unless they begin at the level where the student is. For example, if you have a kid who engages in very low rates of a behavior, let's say, very little on-task behavior, and if you have a criteria for reinforcement that's really high, let's say that initially you expect the student to complete at least 80% of his work, when in baseline he's only been doing, about 10 or 15% of his work, simply isn't going to work. You're requiring too much too quickly. Having a good, clear baseline measure allows you to determine where to start a program. And of course, it allows you to evaluate whether or not it's working, because you compare your intervention data to your baseline data. It's imperative that you have a behavior that's defined very clearly. It doesn't work well unless you've got a good definition and unless you have the appropriate measurement system. If you're measuring a behavior with frequency that should be measured with duration, it's not good. Your data is not going to be very useful. It's best if you have 5 data points in baseline, but 3 is workable. 3 is sort of a minimum. You can't really determine a trend unless you have at least 3 data points. And you should graph your data and take a look at it as you collect it. That allows you to know right away if the intervention is going in the right direction. When you have enough data, draw trend lines, set an aim line that will allow you to evaluate the progress your student's making. So all the stuff we covered in graphing and looking at data fits here. Just a quick review about positive and negative reinforcement. Of course, they both increase behavior, but positive reinforcement increases because it actually the behavior results in something being added. In this case, it's something the person likes or something the person wants to obtain. Negative reinforcement increases behavior because it results in the person removing or avoiding something that the person doesn't like. Both of these are useful for increasing appropriate behavior and problem behavior, as well as maintained by both positive and negative reinforcement. When we talk about natural consequences, we're talking about reinforcers that fit very naturally into the situation. Whenever possible, it's good to make consequences natural. This helps, first of all, it does several things. It makes reinforcement programs stand out less. They sort of blend in to the background. It also ensures that people carrying out the program are more likely to implement it. There's some research that shows that if people see consequences as being natural and fitting the behavior, they're more likely to carry them out. It also, later on, we'll see it facilitates students taking responsibility for their own behavior. We often hear the phrase catch kids being good used in schools these days. There's a lot more to that than one would think. If you're going to use catch kids being good, what we're really talking about is differential attention. You're using your attention as a form of reinforcement. It's much more effective if you identify clear behaviors you're going to reinforce than if you use a generic term like when kids are good, reinforce them. That's one of the reasons that we stressed having clear expectations in a classroom. You want to define exactly what you expect students to do. I found that when I have very clear expectations in a classroom, it's much easier for me to effectively use reinforcement. Also, establish which behaviors you don't want to reinforce and how are you going to respond to those. Are you going to ignore those behaviors, or are you going to use redirection in some way, or are you going to use some other kinds of consequence? The more you plan how you're going to use reinforcement, the more effective people are going to be in your classroom and the more consistent people are going to be. Some of the problems with using reinforcement plans in general and using class-wide strategies in particular is that it does require you to keep an eye on the student data. You know, people are not going to continue to implement strategies if they don't personally see it as something being useful. So I always tried to, in my classroom, when I was working with students and I had paraprofessionals working with me, I had everyone responsible for graphing student data. And then they had to make some assessment as to whether or not they believed the intervention was working. And we would have weekly meetings and we would discuss changes we wanted to make. I found that when I did that, people were much more invested in the interventions. Also, you can't use the same reinforcers over and over again. That causes satiation. Change reinforcers, vary them. If you're using your attention or praise as a reinforcer, vary the way you do praise. Consistency is extremely important. It's important that every student is held to the same standard by each staff person, and that all the behaviors are consistently reinforced by each person. If this doesn't happen, what you'll see is that the kids begin acting and behaving differently when different people are present. And finally, for any reinforcement program to be effective, it has to start where the student is. This is probably one of the biggest mistakes I see when people develop reinforcement programs is they will start out the reinforcement system to reinforce the student where they would like the student to be after intervention. Reinforcement works incrementally. You start out at the level where the student is, and then you have a plan for systematically increasing the criteria for reinforcement over time. You do it in a stepwise fashion, and you increase it when the student is ready. That's how it is most effective, and that's the way it has to be implemented. It takes some time, but you get long-term behavior change when you do it that way. As we said, don't use generic terms like what's good. Describe exactly what you expect students to do. Use the action object format that we talked about.